Constitutions lay the foundation for a nation's governance. They outline government structure, define powers, and enumerate citizens' rights. The U.S. Constitution, adopted in 1787, embodies democracy and liberty. Its concise language presents challenges in modern application. Constitutional interpretation shapes the legal landscape. This essay explores prominent theories of interpretation. Literal interpretation, or textualism, is a straightforward approach to constitutional interpretation. Proponents argue judges should adhere to the Constitution's literal meaning. Critics say language is ambiguous, and literalism can lead to unjust outcomes. The Second Amendment is often cited in these debates. Textualists argue it protects individual firearm rights. Critics argue it ignores historical context and evolving values. Purposive interpretation, in contrast to literal interpretation, seeks to uncover the underlying purpose or intent behind the Constitution's provisions. Proponents of this theory believe that judges should interpret the Constitution in a way that best advances the goals and values that the framers sought to achieve. They argue that focusing solely on the literal text ignores the historical context and broader objectives that motivated the Constitution's drafting. For example, the 14th Amendment, adopted in 1868, guarantees equal protection of the laws to all citizens. While the literal text does not explicitly mention racial segregation, purposive interpretation would consider the amendment's historical context, its aim to address the legacy of slavery and ensure equal rights for African Americans. Supporters of purposive interpretation argue that it provides a more nuanced and flexible approach to constitutional interpretation, allowing judges to adapt the Constitution's principles to new situations and challenges. They believe that it prevents the Constitution from becoming an archaic document irrelevant to modern society. However, critics of purposive interpretation argue that it can be subjective and open to judicial activism. Determining the framers' intent, they argue, is often difficult and can lead to different interpretations based on the historical sources consulted. Critics contend that this approach gives judges excessive leeway to impose their own values and preferences under the guise of interpreting the Constitution. Contextual interpretation, also referred to as the living Constitution approach, emphasizes the dynamic nature of constitutional interpretation. Proponents of this theory argue that the Constitution should be interpreted in light of contemporary circumstances, values, and societal needs. They believe that the Constitution is a living document that must evolve to remain relevant and effective in addressing the challenges of a changing world. For instance, the Eighth Amendment prohibits cruel and unusual punishment. While certain punishments considered acceptable in the 18th century, such as public floggings, are now deemed cruel and unusual, contextual interpretation allows for the Constitution's prohibition to encompass evolving societal standards of decency and humane treatment. Advocates of contextual interpretation argue that it ensures the Constitution's continued relevance and prevents it from becoming a relic of the past. They believe that this approach allows for a more just and equitable society by adapting constitutional principles to contemporary realities. However, critics of contextual interpretation argue that it undermines the stability and predictability of the law. They contend that constantly reinterpreting the Constitution based on shifting societal values erodes its authority and undermines the rule of law. Critics fear that this approach gives judges unchecked power to rewrite the Constitution according to their own personal views rather than adhering to its original meaning.